everybody. This is going to be a re-recording of Friday's stream, which would be Friday, November 18th. It was the first stream that we did in this series, and I ran into a few technical challenges specifically related to internet, which broke the stream up into several different kind of hard to consume pieces. And I thought that it might make sense to re-record it and provide a little more context and content than I was able to originally, given the interruptions and the fact that I got fairly flustered. So we're going to start with general tips. And I would like to start by saying that the following guidelines assume that whatever object is being shaped has not been rotated and is in the default orientation. Referencing the x-axis is going to refer to a horizontally drawn line as we look at the screen, while the y-axis is going to refer to a vertically drawn line as we view a computer screen. So as you can already kind of see in the lower left-hand side of my screen, as I review these steps, I'll be drawing a floating ADA sync base just to sort of assist with the explanation. I feel like this is an object that many of you can relate to, and there will at least be the appropriate context rather than some arbitrary shape I've selected. So, without further ado, when building a constrained part or assembly, I usually follow the same steps in the same order. So, as you can see, I've got a reference image. I think that this is very useful when we're starting. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to draw or define the approximate shape of the object. Be sure to draw every line or arc needed for the finished product and try to get it as close to what you want the finished product to be. So I have my square part here that I'm going to start with, but I have taken some time before the video to draw this in CAD and kind of explain some of our logical constraints. So after I've drawn the rough outline of the part, this is a little better than rough, but I usually constrain every vertical line to the y-axis and every horizontal line to the x-axis. So as we look at this image, we've got 3 horizontal lines that we are going to constrain to the x-axis and 2 vertical lines that we're going to constrain to the y-axis. We've got 1 angled line that I'm actually not going to lock in with any sort of constraint. And we've got 1 arc that we need to make sure is tangent to both of the lines coming off of it. So I'm going to just pause for just a moment to save everybody some time. Well, actually, I'll draw this. It's probably best if I just draw it right here. So the first thing that I normally do is I actually delete everything. So we'll just start with the chained line. Pick a reference point to start from. I'm going to start from the lower right. And I know that this assembly needs to be 27 plus 5.5 inches. So I don't need to try to do the math. Might as well just type it in right there. I'm going to make this 24 inches wide. My angle will stop being stupid. So 5.5. Just going to go roughly 8 in this direction. And then I'm actually going to come over here and we'll say we'll bring it out 12. Now, the overall height of this is wrong because we actually need to be elevated by 9 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this and raise it up 9 inches from where it was. And then I'm going to just draw a line. So now we've got roughly the same shape in both locations. However, we do not have a radius here. So we'll go ahead and address that. I like to use the join for this. And I'm going to set the radius at 2 inches. Click both lines and create the radius. So we've got roughly the same shape in both places. I really like to save my new shape. It's very important to copy what you're doing, make several saves. of what you're doing as you go through the steps in case you make a mistake. That way you can get back. So I've drawn the general shape. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, I'm going to assign my X and Y axis constraints. So because I drew this from scratch, I did not get any automatically displaying constraints. So we'll start with the y-axis. Now, something I'd like to explain before we go further. If you have force visible set to yes, you can select one of your logical constraints and you can click multiple lines without having to go back up and reselect the tool. However, if this is set to no, each time you select a line to define your constraint, you must reselect your tool. I'll demonstrate. So for the x-axis, we're going to make sure this is set to yes, and I can just click on each of the lines I want to set to the x-axis. Now, to demonstrate the difference here, for the y-axis, we'll select my constraint and pick a line. Now, notice I can't just click this line and get my y-axis again. I have to reselect the constraint and select it. So force visible does a couple of things. Obviously, these are now all still visible because they were force visible when I placed them, but whether this is a bug in the software or not, I can't tell you. Leaving this to yes allows you to constrain more without so many clicks. So if that's important to you, now you can kind of speed your workflow up a little bit. So because I don't want this cluttering up my drawing, I'm actually going to hide the constraints. I'm going to save my shape and try again. So I'm verifying that the constraints I wanted are where they need to be. Now, because I did draw an arc here, I'm not completely sure what makes Cab.YY say, well, we're going to put an auto constraint here, or we're not going to automatically constrain this. I can't say, but what I can tell you is already by default, my arc is tangent with the two lines coming off of it. But just for the sake of demonstration, I deleted my tangent constraints. I'm going to select my tangent constraint tool. I'm going to pick a line and an arc that I want to be tangent. So then again, I'm going to pick the arc and then the line. So now this object, or these three entities, if you will, they are tangent as we would like them to be. And then I'm just going to hide the constraints again so I don't have to see them. So at this point, we've got our general logical constraints applied. We've got the general shape. Now there's a lot to this in terms of getting the assembly to place itself automatically. And obviously I'm just working with a part here. I'm not working with an actual assembly for this. I'm not trying to build an ADA assembly. I'm trying to demonstrate how to constrain shapes. If you have one of these and you want to build something like this, get in touch with me and I will gladly help you out. There's a lot to it, but this will just cover general shape constraints. So the next thing I normally do after defining my X and Y axis is I address any angled lines by fixing their angle at a static value or referencing a parameter I've previously defined on the part or assembly. In this case, I don't believe that setting a fixed angle value is the wisest decision. That's one of the harder values to determine. And we can do it through much simpler means, to be completely honest. So after the angles have been set, I start constraining my arcs. So I've already set them tangent to any other lines, but I have not fixed the radius value. So we'll come to the radius dimensional constraint and select the arc. And I know that I already had it at 2. I want to keep it at 2. I want this to be 2 no matter what. Let's just say I've got a handheld contour bander, and I want to make sure that I can always get that radius, and 2 inches is the minimum that I can reliably get. So I want this to never change from 2 inches because that's what matches my equipment. So I'm just going to click OK. So now at this point, my arc is constrained to a radius value of 2, so no matter what else happens with this assembly, it will always be at the right radius for my equipment to do what I need it to do. So now that I've got the arc set and I know that it's tangent, this would be when I would start applying all of my dimensional constraints. So that's more or less it for order of operations. I'm going to use this object to kind of explain one of the other questions that was answered, but in terms of general workflow, best practices, which auto constraints we apply, everything that's kind of related to the question that we're seeing up here, question number 3, I hope I've covered. Let me know if you have any questions. So moving on, um, the next thing I'd like to demonstrate is really kind of the 5th and 6th questions I received together. So question 5 was how to use constraints, specifically arcs, which we've kind of talked about. And question 6 was really just a sort of general orthographic constraints request for help, if I'm not mistaken. So we're going to kind of go through both of these two questions together, and we'll use this object. So we'll start here with arc constraints. As I've already demonstrated, when you've got an arc, the most important things that you can do really, there's 3 of them. One, just make sure that it makes sense. You can't have a radius that's 30 inches on a part that's like 20 inches wide and expect to get anything valuable out of it. Set your constraints within the context of what you're building. There is probably somebody out there who's smart enough to make one object capable of doing everything in the world they'd ever need, but that's not me, and I don't really believe that that's the right way to handle this. So just build your objects within the context of what you're doing and just apply some general reason and you should be all right. So with a radius of 2 here and the points locked in place and tangent to the lines, there's not a whole lot more that needs to happen with this. Again, just make sure you assign a radius constraint to keep that value, to keep that arc at the appropriate radius for you, and then make sure you're making the 2 endpoints tangent to whatever's coming off of it. You really should not have any more problems with arcs if you maintain that basic philosophy. So moving on to orthographic constraints. All right, so the general idea here, these are all of our logical constraints, if you will. If I turn my logical constraints layer off and I turn my dimensional constraints layer on, which I left over here, just bring these over and put them in the context. So these are the different kinds of constraints that I would use within this assembly. We've already talked about the radius constraint, which I do have selected here. I would be using an ortho constraint for my dx value of this part, or if this were the end view of a cabinet, it would be the cabinet's depth to control the overall depth of this unit. And then I would be using an ortho constraint to control the overall height of the unit, and that would be referencing the cabinet's dy value. So in our example here, I've got a height and a width that I'm going to use. So instead of cab.dz, I'm just going to use cab.dx for this particular example. So I'm going to just drop my object down so that I'm kind of within the container of the assembly, we'll say. And I'm going to edit the shape of this, and I'm going to bring, well, I'm actually not going to edit the shape of this. I'm going to change the height of my assembly. So now we get a 24-inch by 23.5-inch tall unit, which should be pretty close to what I have drawn here. 24, 23.5, perfect. So we'll just select ortho distance. And when using the ortho tool, it's important to select the midpoints of the two lines that you're trying to do the ortho distance between. And notice I can either move this vertically for a horizontal dimension, or I can move it horizontally for a vertical dimension. This behaves very similarly to the dimension tool in Cabinet Vision, which means that you can get the wrong dimension pulled if you're not careful. So just take your time and be cautious and pull the right dimension. So rather than 24, again, normally if this were a cabinet, I'd be referring to the cabinet's depth, but because I'm just doing a part on face view, I'm going to call this cab.dx. And then I'm going to do another ortho constraint from the center point of the bottom line to the center point of the top line. And this one, I will be calling cab.dy, just like I did in the example. So at this point, let's just kind of take a look at what our assembly is going to do if we start changing sizes before we have done any other constraining. So let's just say we're going to be 30 wide, which would normally be the cabinet's depth in this case. And let's say, I don't know, 32 tall. So aside from the fact that the part doesn't have any placement intelligence within the assembly, we got some general stuff right, but this would never conform to ADA compliance for several reasons. So we need to do a little bit more. So first of all, I'm going to do some positioning control, and interestingly enough, I was expecting this to grow differently, but that's okay. So just verifying that these dimensions, these constraints did not do something weird, and I think my cab.dy constraint did, interestingly enough. So I'm just going to ortho constrain this again and bring this out. All right. So at this point, we can apply a length constraint, which the length constraint does not deal with multiple entities. The length constraint is for an individual line. So you only have to click once. And I'm going to force this to be, what did I say over here? 7 1/8. And I'm okay with that just being a fixed value because I know according to our ADA image over here, I need 8 inches minimum. And so 7 1/8 plus what would be the drawer front or false front on the face of the assembly should give me close to 8, as I've shown over here. Plus, I've got some radius that'll give us a little bit more. So 7 1/8. Now, this will remain 7 1/8 no matter what happens at this point. So the next constraint that we should do is an ortho constraint to keep this distance here at 5.5 because there is a minimum distance from the floor to the knee space. So we really care about a lot more than just this distance, but when you break down what is required, this can just be cabinet's height minus cabinet's elevation minus the 27-inch minimum dimension that's indicated on the drawing. So this would be cab.dy minus cab.yy or cab.y. If you don't know what cab.yy is or why it's there, search the forums for it. It is essentially a tool to help the cabinets behave the way you expect them to behave when they're in the assembly editor. So I'll just do cab.y for this to simplify. Cab.dy plus minus 27, which is a fixed value defined. And well, that's kind of embarrassing. I had thought that that was the math here. Ah, right. So, interesting. We literally just ran into what I was talking about. This needs to be cab.yy because the y value of the cabinet is just, because we're in the assembly editor, it is negative half of the assembly's height. So, cab.yy. So, our cab.yy is not high enough. So before we do this, I'm going to go ahead and elevate the cabinet. Otherwise, we're going to run into constraint issues. So 9 inches minimum vertically is what we need to have for an ADA assembly to be compliant. So one last time here, we will do an ortho dimensional constraint, cab.dy plus cab.yy minus 27. This should be 5.5. Wonderful. I'm not crazy. So now that we have established a fixed ortho dimension to control the height of this, we've established a fixed length dimension to control our knee space. We've got a fixed height of the cabinet's dy value, a fixed width of the cabinet's dx, which again should be dz if we were at the end view of an assembly, which we are not. The only other thing that we should really be doing here is applying a length constraint to this bottom line. So we know that, and everything else aside, like the ADA rules can be picked apart, and the distance is really about the reach, not the cabinet depth and all of that stuff. That's not what I'm here to demonstrate. Again, let's focus on how do we get the constraints to work in the ways that we'd like. That way you can apply it to your particular case. So this is going to be another length constraint. Now, it's not an ortho constraint because there is nothing for me to ortho from. It's not a distance constraint because, again, a distance thing would be like the distance between 2 points, for example, and that's not what we're trying to get. Now, I could say I want the distance between this point and this point, but I feel like you're much better off just using the length constraint here, and we will say cab.dx, even though it should be dz if we were working within an assembly. Again, sorry about that. I should have changed my orientation before I started, but we're too late at this point. So cab.dx minus 13. I'm picking 13 because I know, according to the ADA compliance guidelines here, I need to have at least 11 inches minimum from this point up here to this point down here. So if I say cabinet overall depth minus 13, I should be within compliance every time. I should always have more than 11 inches, which is, I mean, I don't personally need to hit ADA compliance perfectly. I'd rather give myself some wiggle room, a little bit of breathing room. So cab.dx minus 13 gives me a value of 11. And notice it just pulled this line back. Our radius remained tangent. We don't even need to do anything with this particular line here. Again, if we were to try to set an angle, then we have to do a lot more math, and it's going to cause problems with the tangent condition of the arc to the line. So in this particular case, you really want to leave this angle alone, and even the length of this line. Just let it do what it needs to do. And if you're following all of the other guidelines for ADA compliance in a case like this, your assembly should do pretty reliably what you need it to do. So hopefully that covered ortho constraints and arcs and maybe even a couple of the other things about constraints that I had hoped to share during the original video, but frankly just kind of didn't get around to doing. So on to the next one. All right, so I've jumped over to a different assembly, and then this was an assembly that was submitted by somebody, and they asked about like wall cubbies. So imagine you had some hooks hanging from the tops of these sections for people to put their clothes in or something like that. Just maybe like almost kind of like individual lockers that aren't secured. So in order to make this happen, I've done a few different things. First of all, we've got a bottom radius value of 13, and that is actually, it's sort of set and defined originally by UCS, and I won't go too deeply into it, but it is always a good idea when you're dealing with a value that might change like this, a radius specifically that's controlled with a value. I believe it is important to set limits, to set limitations. In other words, I don't want to allow the user to set a bottom radius value greater than the cabinet's depth or greater than the cabinet's height, depending. So if my height is greater than my depth, obviously I don't want to set my radius at my height. So basically there's a little bit of logic there that I believe is important to apply to your assembly and your attribute value. In this case, I've not allowed the radius values to be anything less than cabinet width minus 1 or cabinet height minus 1, depending on which is the greater of the two. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and really I'll just change it to a 14-inch deep unit. So I followed suit with my instructions that I provided before. Draw the general shape, assign your X and Y axis constraints, make your arc tangent to the lines coming off of it, and establish a radius constraint on the arc itself. So on this particular one, I've associated the value with ACC underscore bottom radius, which is just that 13. It's that value that I was pointing out before, this bottom radius value. So if I change this, our radius changes. So what happens when I get down here to 1 inch? It allows me, if I try to go less than 1 inch though, because that's beyond the extent I've defined in my UCS, it kind of lets me for a second, but once my assembly rebuilds, it jumps back to that limited number. And I think if you used colon equals for this value when querying for it to be beyond the defined values rather than just a standard equation, I don't think that it would even let it go to the bad size, but I haven't really tested it. That's not what this is for. Anyhow, hopefully this was enough of a short little example to kind of help you wrap your head around how building an object like this should work, and specifically how the arcs work in general. So the last two things I want to cover in this before I shut this video down is question 1.2. Is there any way to lock a point relative to the center of a part? In short, yes. The long answer is that there are so many different ways to do this. The best thing that I could do would be to ask for a specific example where somebody needs to maintain a point in a certain place no matter what, and I could definitely provide a demonstration, but I struggle to grasp when something like this might be required, which which means that if I try to explain it, I'm just going to ramble and go on and try to show an example that might or might not satisfy the needs of the person asking the question. So, yes, it's possible. No, I don't have a really great way to demonstrate how to do it. And last but not least, just daily use. Somebody asked how to use the shape editor daily. Um, I use it for so many things, truly. I use it for CAD layout for designs. As you saw earlier in my video here, I had, that's not what I wanted. Where am I here? This was the one. Sorry. So as I showed, I laid all of this out in CAD before I even decided to shape my part. I feel like CAD is much more forgiving than the shape editor. You don't have to have closed shapes. It gives you the opportunity to really get some things laid out before you start actually building with an object that can break. You can break it. You can do it wrong. You can lose all your work when you're shaping something. But when you're just working in CAD, that is not the case. It's good to know how to use the shape editor if you need to apply operations to a part. I mean, I can't stress enough how much the shape editor is a part of every aspect of cabinet vision. The more comfortable you get with it, the better user you will most likely be. So I hope everybody not only enjoyed the original stream, but I hope this sort of recap video was even more helpful than the stream itself was, and I hope to put on something more like this for the stream 2 weeks from now. Thank you guys all. I appreciate it.